Big ol' content warning here. We're going to be getting into the dark and depressing in today's episode, so strap in, here we go. So why are so many people nihilistic, and why do they feel the desire to express their nihilistic and negative and cynical perspectives with such vigor and passion? For one thing, we seem to crave absolution. This is true for the majority of humans, it would seem, and especially the Westerner. It would seem that the nihilist is paranoid of uncertainty. As one goes to garner an explanation of a world that consistently robs them of it, one necessarily must engage in a practice of radical acceptance of that which they do not know. Otherwise, one might end up gravitating towards stories and some search for assurance between various philosophies, some perfectly consistent narrative that seems to blend all axioms. But of course, this is impossible. And at some level, the cynical nihilist realizes this, but instead of working to form a healthy perspective, they end up casting their opinions around all willy-nilly, disturbing and offending who they may. They'll end up chilling at a bar and say something utterly depressing, and then when somebody confronts them on it, they'll just say, "I'm just a realist, bro." But reality is what you make of it, to a large degree. We don't know all the facts. We can't, so we cannot really claim what reality is like in its true nature, what at least ontological reality is like, and we certainly can't describe what epistemological reality is like, to be specific, an agreed upon perspective that fits all humans. So it would seem that life requires us to practice humble acceptance of our ignorance, and often. And I should say, dialectic behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy are fantastic for arriving at this kind of acceptance. Now, typically, the cynical nihilist does not hold a healthy mindfulness practice, and their self-degrading perspectives tend to come out unconsciously. We want to try and give them grace, though, and not simply react negatively to their negativity. Otherwise, that's just going to exacerbate their perspective that people are mechanistic, deluded meat machines. Let me explain what I mean by that by delving a little bit into ancient Western philosophy. So, Democritus and many of the ancient Greeks got along with this idea that we are composed of atoms, and this is called atomism. The human can be basically broken down into parts, and this is very true for science and for physical medicine. But when it comes to the conception of the self, this can be very dangerous. Because when you look at yourself just as a collection of atoms that are completely directed by determinism and causality, this can kind of be very disturbing, at least to the Westerner. From childhood, the Easterner seems to understand the concept that the identity is indeed shared amongst their culture and amongst their friends and those in their relationships. In the East, the concept of nothingness and emptiness is more thought of as an infinite fullness, this kind of bhavanga, or the ground of all being, from which all life and existence emerges. A very common metaphor for this is soil, like very healthy soil that allows life to grow. It allows existence to come into being. Whereas in the West, we think of nothingness as a kind of no-thingness. And there are a couple ways to look at that as well. Plato kind of thought of this as reality taking multiple forms. There is no one true thing. A chair is not just a chair, it's also a sitting object. It's also a stool, it's also four legs and a back and a seat, and it's also wood molecules, and it's also the atoms of the wood molecules, and so on and so forth. And this allows for some nuance in the way that we think about ourselves and we think about objects and objective reality. There are many folks that are saying because your atoms never truly make contact, you never actually touch anyone, you never touch your hand to your hand, everything is separate. And this doesn't mean that you aren't a whole human. You are a distributed cognition system. You are embedded in reality. In cognitive science, this is embedded cognition. You share your brain and your identity with the rest of the world. This is also a very Eastern concept, and it's hard to kind of absorb that and embody and embrace that once you're already an adult that's developed in the Western paradigm. To put it in some flowery language, you are in monistic unity with all that is. You're participating in that infinite realm of intelligibility. You are this ground of all being, the substrate from which all life emerges and participates in itself. See, Westerners just aren't taught to think like that. The West is more individualistic and egocentric. The personality and the identity seems to be more crystallized and permanent. So when the nihilist says, "I'm just a realist," this is likely because they grew up in the West, where the individualized, singular sense of ego is the primary modus operandi, and they feel they must express that singular perspective despite social context. And remember that Westerners do tend to be ignorant of context. So let's look into this a little bit further here. The age of scientific enlightenment seems to have cast us into what John Vervaeke calls a meaning crisis. The primary narrative is this whole mechanistic meat machine, where every human is just the product of their genes and their environment. And furthermore, we lack the collective sense of purpose and fulfilling occupations as well. We're kind of left to our own devices to manifest this sense of identity, and the narratives that were provided are rather unsubstantial. And Nietzsche saw the writing on the wall 170 years ago. He realized that the religious ideologies and narratives that once so united us are now dissolved, and there's no turning back. He said, "We have killed God, and we cannot wash the blood from our hands. We have unchained ourselves from the sun, and we are forever falling." Very dramatic language there, but it seems quite accurate, and that's just part of the puzzle there. He also realized that societies and civilization were expanding far beyond the smaller, connected tribes that we used to exist in, and that were steadily becoming more disconnected than ever. But Nietzsche was a Westerner. He didn't grow up in the East, where the sense of the self is more distributed. Thus, he kind of went about this idea of the Übermensch, this fully actualized self that is the ultimate form of humanity. This set unreachable standards and biased us towards further comparison against those that we feel that we can't really equate to. The identity is arrived at by social comparison, and today's nihilist sees the flaws in this and either gives up or works actively to oppose this paradigm when they see it, and this naturally brings other people down when they're striving to better themselves under these paradigms. Now, as I understand Sartre and the other existentialists, our nihilistic crises seem to come from a need for physical realness. We seem to be very paranoid of non-existence, and this whole idea of the self as a distributed system of interdependent cognition does not rest easily on the Western ear. Now, in my opinion, to exist is to be intentional with one's existence, to hold purpose and meaning and value in one's actions. The meaningful life is a connected life, an identity based on the contributions made to others and participating with others. This can be seen in music and art, in engineering, in medical breakthroughs, in educational impact, and I encourage you to try to continue this list yourself. As Jean-Paul Sartre put it, existence precedes essence. You are not nothing. You are not a random case of no-thingness. If anything, you are an existing thing, and from that you can choose your own essence. You can choose what that existence means to you. You can choose to make yourself what you want to be. To do otherwise can lead to a significant lack of self-control, which can lead to cynicism and unchecked hedonism. And we'll be talking more about hedonism and how to think about that in other episodes. Now, with this vast abundance of information and opinions available online, one is presented a nearly infinite list of labels, identities, virtues, and ideologies to aspire to and ascribe to. The nihilist tends to see these and just instantly gives up, thinks that they're all made up by humans, which they are, but they take that in the negative direction, and they kind of end up openly mocking those that are trying to adhere and aspire to these virtues and values. Basically, when we encounter situations or perspectives that go beyond our cognitive capacities for reasoning, and our brains still try to account for all of them, we reach what's called combinatorial explosion. There's simply too many combinations of factors at play, and we have to narrow down on what's most relevant to our interests. But if one does not have any real interest, that becomes their reality, and once again, one sinks into nihilism and the no-thingness aspect of nothingness. In these cases, when there are too many options available to us, we are logically permitted to default to that which benefits and behooves our sanity and happiness, and that of others. A good rule is to do no harm, physically or psychologically. This is a good prerogative to live by in life, in my opinion. But because so many philosophers are overly left-brained and logical, they end up craving certainty and closure and absolution. They become lost in classification in the attempts to match epistemological and ontological certainty with life's harshness, and don't permit themselves to stop because they crave logical consistency. But our brains can't really sustain that consistency. They create cognitive dissonance whether we like it or not. And of course the exact opposite takes place in religion, where the more overly right-brained, emotion-led people kind of throw logic to the wind to satisfy their spiritual feelings and desires. This is of course matched with that desire for logical consistency, but the only consistency that they gravitate towards is a highly underexamined one. This is where the justification and the consistency aspect of that is justified through the Bible or the Quran, or whatever the holy book may be. And this is why most nihilists turn out to be atheists and openly mock religion, despite its very unifying qualities. The nihilist gravitates towards infinite ways to be depressed about life's emptiness, or to be disappointed in other people's actions, and that's a very cold reality to embody. Transversely, there are infinite ways to view life's fullness, and view life through a sense of awe and wonder, gratitude, empathy, humility, and loving kindness. So when these negative feelings and perspectives arise, we can remind ourselves that our brains are limited in what they can consciously comprehend and imagine, and they do tend to settle into one major way of perceiving unconsciously. So it's best to use our consciousness to choose the predominant ways of believing and perceiving that promote our best lived experience. And I call this the liberation of the infinite. Essentially, you can create an entire new perspective. This is often made easier by psychedelics or by therapeutic interventions, but ultimately this journey is up to you to initiate and fully embrace and engage. The neurology of this does indeed seem to be quite mechanistic. There's the term the path of least resistance, and your brain kind of gravitates towards that path of least resistance in its world model, again because of combinatorial explosion and there being all these factors. This is why we rely so heavily on narrative and the story that we tell ourselves. And fortunately, we do have a conscious choice in that. It just takes practice to form those new pathways. Dedicated effort and repeated effort over many weeks or months or even possibly years. Meditation very much helps this. Taking your therapy, reciting your mantras, taking up healthy rituals, and staying confident that this will work, because eventually you will lay a new path in walking. This is the way that Evan Thompson describes it in his book on neurophenomenology. Basically, when there are too many factors, take a break, step back and breathe, and choose a path that behooves you and others. And by employing this way of thinking, we can feel liberated from our indecisiveness, and begin to stop defaulting to the negative and start defaulting to the positive. In this way, we are liberated by the infinity. And I would argue that the same applies in politics. When there are too many factors to account for, as we see in the majority of politics, we want to default to some safe fundamentals by prioritizing empathy and loving kindness in the way that we make our legislation. But that's a topic for another video. Essentially, reality is infinitely appreciable. This is kind of my word of the year here. This simply means that whatever you're engaging in has infinite capacities to be appreciated. And you can hold sustained gratitude in keeping that as a lifelong practice. Now, this is more realistic to me. It's not like life is meant to garner constant happiness, that every experience is meant to be pleasurable and bring about joy. It's more about the idea that every situation that you experience can be reflected upon and processed. And it's up to you how you go about that processing, whether it's done in a healthy fashion or a counterproductive one. And this is kind of where mindfulness practices seem to come in. And we'll be discussing those in many future episodes. Alright, let's take a moment to look at nihilism through the lens of psychology and narcissism. There seem to be many problems made in the assumptions about negativity bias and narcissism, or as it's now referred to as narcissistic personality disorder. When narcissism is taken as a psychological, pathological condition, a patient might hear this and think, I now have a genetic disposition towards over-focusing on the one negative thing someone said, despite the 9 other positive things that the person said. I will always be like this and I must forever fight it. The concept of NPD is now reinforcing the idea that people must permanently remain a narcissist, and this matches up very well with nihilism. The nihilist essentially has no reason to care about anyone else but themselves, and when you have diagnostic criteria that says that's just who you are, then you may indeed just continue living that way. And I say this with confidence because I've seen it in real life. That being said, let's look at the concept of the game of life. Life is what you make of it, so make it great. Of course, it's not that simple. We do kind of have to employ a sense of rose-colored glasses, and this is often thought of as deceiving yourself, but that's so rudimentary. That's such a terrible take on that. We must keep some kind of perception of ourself and our reality. And as we were saying before, you have a choice in which one of those you default to most primarily. So as Tennyson put it, nature is red in tooth and claw. Let me get this actual quote, because it's pretty bleak. 1,000 types are gone. I care for nothing. All shall go. Nature is a world of strife and conflict and violence. It is red in tooth and claw. Okay. So that's like a whole spiel that he gives on this concept. He's been witnessing the trade-offs of nature, witnessing indeed the violence that many of the other animals engage in to survive. And we do inhabit that world, but we need not participate like that. We build houses and we grow food. We don't have to participate in the violence and all these terrible ways of looking at it. Because indeed there are infinite ways to be blown away by the horrible atrocities of the world and the violence that nature has had to go through, the requirement of so much sacrifice and bloodshed to bring us to the species that we are today. But of course, there are also infinite ways to appreciate life. And you can go too far in either one of these directions as well. I'm sure you've heard the term toxic positivity, and indeed, you can be living in a state of blissful ignorance, and we don't want to be in that state either. We want to find this kind of happy medium. And just to get into this a little bit more, you can think of this in terms of statistics, and I think this is kind of how nihilists tend to reason, they might think that the majority of cases and the majority of the species that came before us, most of those have involved some kind of arduous pain and sacrifice and displeasure. And another way to conceive of this is through dukkha, which is the idea of embracing different versions of this, of suffering, strife, adversity, and degradation of experiences. And that is also encouraging of a very much radical acceptance-based perspective on life. But I already have videos breaking down that concept, and we won't get into that here. But also through the lens of neuroscience and consciousness science. As Anil Seth puts it, your brain hallucinates your reality. It's all an illusion that's produced by your brain. And that is also a very deterministic and mechanistic perspective on that. Your brain is interpreting reality. Your brain is taking in loads of sensory information, and it's doing this relevance realization process where it's honing in on the most relevant and important and salient information to make decisions and to propagate more patterns of types of thoughts and patterns of behavior. And fortunately, you're not just entirely beholden to that process. You can choose how you interpret reality. And I keep saying this, you can choose through many different forms which of these interpretations and perspectives your brain most commonly defaults to. And determinism doesn't have to be completely detached. That narrative itself is insisting upon the idea that you are causally connected to anything and everything at all times. Butterfly effects are everywhere. And indeed, there are many positive ways to look at that as well. So this whole idea that we hold such a vast capacity to improve our perspectives, make ourselves who we want to be, this is often thought of as playing the game of life. I want to say that the nihilist hears this and thinks, well, yeah, once you start using terms like game, then it indeed returns to just being meaningless. Like, this is all just a game, then what are we doing here? So let's look at how we can break down that concept. So in this regard, we can think of value and meaning in life as being arrived at through two main sources. Essentially, these boil down to playing in the game and examining the game. Now, folks like Steven Pinker might boil this down to romanticism versus reductionism. This is mentioned in his book, The Blank Slate. But the way I see it is, when we're learning about the rules of game and how reality works, this is more so in the realm of science and philosophy. And when we're playing in the game, that's more so indulging in other people's creations and their entertainment and playing within this four dimensions that we most commonly occupy. And this is participatory knowledge, as Vervaeke would put it, and this is also done with yourself. So this isn't just indulging in other people's creations, it's also creating for yourself. So some common examples of this are music, art, hiking, yoga, camping, engineering, and fantasy literature, and I encourage you to create that list as well yourself. Learning about the game could be thought of as reading nonfiction literature, doing experiments, discussing and debating philosophy of existence, or just holding debates in general. And both of these have their value, but both can be pursued as a primary means of engagement. And we must choose how much we engage in each of these. Understanding how much each of these benefits us is very much a personal journey. Indeed, some find studying the game to be much more fulfilling, using logic and reason to understand reality, and I would imagine this serves the individual best when they have shared what they've learned. The wise have a duty to share their wisdom, ideally in a non-judgmental fashion. Now let's look at this through the lens of escapism and consumerism, and then we'll close this video out. Essentially, we can partake or participate, and as we've been discussing, it's important not to do too much of either. Playing in the game, appreciating and indulging in the productions of others is crucial, but we can easily become swayed by literal products or by games with unsubstantial narrative structures and supplant our own life meaning for those made by others. Or we can become addicted to alternate realities through literal drug abuse, and the combination of these two seems to be very much in favor as of late. And of course, we can go too far into examining reality and instill or perpetuate existential crises. But the wise philosopher will also remember to be present and mindful and appreciative of the little things in life, the little experiences that aren't produced by other people that you just see in nature, like appreciating a flower on a pleasant walk. Because if you go too far in the other direction of engaging in other people's productions and their fulfilled goals, you may end up leading into expectation, and expectations can lead to disappointment. Alright, let's take this into a bit more depth here. As we've been describing it, gratitude and openness to surprise can also lead to a kind of expectation for surprise. We don't want to just do away with expectation outright. It seems like the nihilist is more engaged in a mode of expectation of reality just to continue to be sucking every single day, or just to be this condensed and unsupportive and very anti-human kind of world to be living in. Like, the world is not meant for humans. There's also this perspective that humans are a fluke accident, and that also takes the meaning out of the world. And this is where we get the term meaning making. Like, we are meaning making creatures. It is in our nature to make the meaning of what we are interpreting. We see a shaking bush, and the meaning of that to us is possible predator. So this story and narrative based conception of ourselves and our reality is deeply set in our genetics. So let's take a few quotes and then we'll close this out here. We must let go of the life we have planned so as to accept the one that is waiting for us. This is Joseph Campbell. To me, this expresses the value of acceptance, and depending on the interpretation, allows for a sliding scale approach to one's destiny. A nuanced, unpredictable future is more realistic, but again, most brains crave control and predictability. This is also another genetic disposition and a natural emotional state. It's very close to the brain's properties of predictive processing. We're genetically disposed towards making assumptions and expectations about the world, and this is kind of how we survived all this time. The quality of our expectations determines the quality of our actions. This is by Adam Godwin, an existential psychotherapist. And this is quite deep, and it also implies more existential agency, which is prior to acting. Max Lucado says, "Lower your expectations of Earth. This isn't heaven, so don't expect it to be." Now this can be interpreted as a realist's answer or a nihilist answer. So we're kind of presented a dual message here. We don't want to get our hopes up too much, but we also need to remain hopeful. It's yet another case where we have to discover a healthy balance and find a healthy path for ourselves. And this is kind of what you want to encourage when you encounter a nihilist today. You want to give them kind of this nuanced approach. Try to not be judgmental because they're probably going to lash out. They're probably going to be very reactive. Just gently introduce to them the idea that there are multiple ways of looking at things all the time. Life is infinitely appreciable and infinitely interpretable. That's all for this video. I really appreciate your time and attention. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.